There was a man known as the Fox in a Suit, a man with the polite smile of a businessman, but the cold eyes of a killer. His name was Michael Frank Jeffery. He was the one who held the soul of Jimi Hendrix. While the world worshipped Jimi as a freedom god of the hippie culture, for Mike Jeffery, Jimi was just a number, an asset that needed to be exploited to the last drop of blood. Jeffery was not an ordinary manager. He was a former military intelligence officer who brought the brutal mindset of war and the tricks of the underworld into art. He could smile and invite you to a drink with his left hand, while his right hand was quietly unraveling your life with slave contracts. This is the profile of the most powerful man in the dark, suspected of committing the most heinous crime, liquidating the greatest legend of the 20th century to collect insurance money. Michael Jeffery was born in South London in 1933, but it was in the gritty northeast city of Newcastle where he would forge his reputation. This city in the 1930s was not a place for dreamers. It was a city of steel, coal, and ships, a place where the sky was perpetually stained with soot, and the wind off the River Tyne cut through you like a knife. It was a hard city that bred hard men, but Jeffery was not destined for the shipyards or the coal mines. He came from a family that valued discipline and order. His father was a postal worker, a respectable, steady job in unstable times, but young Michael had ambitions that stretched far beyond the gray horizon of the Northeast. He was intelligent, sharp-witted, and possessed a natural authority that belied his age. His education wasn't found in the music halls, but in the military. In a move that would define his entire worldview, Jeffery entered the military, allegedly training at institutions reserved for the officer class, though the full extent of his service remains shrouded in mystery. Sandhurst is the West Point of Britain. It is the institution that trains the officer class, the elite leaders of the British Army. It is a place where individuality is crushed. In its place, they instill rigid discipline, strategic thinking, and an absolute reverence for the chain of command. At Sandhurst, Jeffery learned that the world is divided into two categories, those who give orders and those who follow them. He learned that sentimentality is a weakness and that the objective always justifies the means. Upon graduation, he didn't merely serve in the ranks. Jeffery joined the intelligence corps. This is the first crucial key to unlocking his psyche. He wasn't an infantryman charging a hill, he was a man operating in the shadows. He served with the British Army during the Suez Crisis in 1956 and later in Cyprus. These were dirty, complicated conflicts. The Suez Crisis, in particular, was a geopolitical mess involving spies, secret deals, and the toppling of governments. In the heat of Egypt and the dusty streets of Cyprus, Jeffery wasn't learning how to play the guitar. He was allegedly learning the dark arts of espionage. He was learning how to gather information, how to leverage secrets, how to destabilize an opponent psychologically, and how to vanish when the heat got too high. There have always been whispers, rumors that Jeffery never denied and perhaps actively encouraged, that his involvement went deeper than just standard military service. Associates later claimed he spoke of working with MI5, of having connections to the darker corners of the British secret state. He spoke Russian. He knew how to handle explosives. He carried himself not like a businessman, but like a man who knew where the bodies were buried because he had held the shovel. Whether he was a master spy or merely a soldier who embellished his past to intimidate people is almost irrelevant. The effect was the same. When he left the military in the late 1950s, he didn't leave the mindset behind. He looked at civilian life and saw it as just another theater of operations. He looked at the burgeoning youth culture not as a movement of liberation, but as a territory to be conquered. By the turn of the 1960s, the grim austerity of post-war Britain was beginning to crack. A new generation was emerging, the teenager. They had disposable income, they had energy, and they were bored. They wanted to dance, they wanted to drink, and they wanted to listen to the new, dangerous sounds coming from America: jazz, blues, and rock and roll. Jeffrey, now out of uniform, but still wearing the armor of a sharp suit and a terrifying stare, saw the opportunity. He returned to Newcastle, but he didn't look for a desk job. He looked for the night. He began to build an empire of clubs. He started with the Marimba, a coffee bar that became a jazz haunt, but his crown jewel was the Club A-Go-Go. If you were young in Newcastle in the early 60s, the Club A-Go-Go was the center of the universe. It was a dark, cavernous space on Percy Street, smelling of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and teenage sweat. It was where the New World was being born, but running a nightclub in a tough port city like Newcastle wasn't a job for the faint of heart. It required muscle. It required the ability to navigate the local underworld, to pay off the right people, and to ensure that the violence stayed manageable. Jeffrey thrived in this environment. He ran the Club A-Go-Go like a military base. The bouncers were his infantry. The till was his objective. There are stories from this era that paint a chilling portrait of the man. He was known to keep a loaded handgun in his office desk, a rarity in Britain, where gun control was strict. He didn't carry it for show. He carried it because he believed in absolute leverage. One famous anecdote involves a rival promoter or a troublesome gangster coming to see Jeffrey. Jeffrey supposedly placed a newspaper on his desk, lit it on fire, and stared at the man through the flames, without blinking until the visitor left, terrified. It was theatrical, yes, but it worked. He established himself as the untouchable kingpin of the Newcastle scene. But Jeffrey was too ambitious to be satisfied with selling beer to teenagers. He noticed that the bands playing on his stage were generating a fervor that bordered on religious hysteria. He realized that the real money wasn't in the venue. It was in the talent. He began to scout. He wasn't looking for virtuosos. He was looking for raw energy. He was looking for something he could package and sell. In 1962 and 1963, a group of local musicians began making waves in Newcastle. They were rough, they were gritty, and they played American R&B with a ferocity that made the polite pop of London sound like nursery rhymes. They were called the Allen Price Combo, but they soon changed their name to something that fit their sound and their stage presence: the Animals. Fronted by Eric Burden, a short, stocky singer with a voice like a foghorn and the soul of a black bluesman, the Animals were electric. They became the house band at the Club A-Go-Go. Jeffrey watched them from the back of the room. He saw the way the crowd reacted to Burden's screaming vocals. He saw the way Alan Price's organ driving the rhythm made people dance. He saw dollar signs. He approached the band with a proposition. He would manage them. He would take them out of the grime of Newcastle and put them on the biggest stages in the world. In exchange, he would handle everything: the money, the bookings, the contracts. The band, young, naive, and desperate for success, signed. They didn't read the fine print. They didn't ask about Jeffrey's offshore accounts. They just saw a man in a suit who commanded respect and seemed to have the keys to the kingdom. Jeffrey brought in a partner to handle the musical side of things: Peter Grant, who would later go on to manage Led Zeppelin, and later Mickey Most for production. But Jeffrey was the boss. He applied his military logistics to the band. He moved them to London. He booked them into grueling tours. He worked them like dogs. And it worked. In 1964, the Animals recorded a traditional folk song that they had rearranged into a brooding, electric masterpiece. House of the Rising Sun. The song was a monster. It went to #1 in the UK and the US. It transformed the Animals from local heroes into global superstars overnight. They were suddenly peers of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The money began to pour in, millions of pounds in today's currency. But this is where the dark genius of Michael Jeffery truly began to shine. While the Animals were playing to screaming crowds in arenas across America, living out their rock and roll fantasies, Jeffery was busy constructing a financial labyrinth designed to trap them. The first major betrayal involved the publishing rights to House of the Rising Sun. The song was a traditional folk song, meaning it was in the public domain. Anyone could arrange it and claim the royalties. The arrangement was a group effort. Burden's vocals, Hilton Valentine's arpeggiated guitar, Alan Price's organ. But when the record was pressed, the credit didn't read traditional, arranged by the Animals. It read traditional, arranged by Alan Price. Why? The story Jeffery spun was that there wasn't enough room on the label for everyone's names, so they just used Price's name alphabetically, and they would sort out the money later. It was a lie. By assigning the rights to one member, Jeffery shattered the unity of the band. Alan Price began receiving the songwriting royalties, the real wealth, while the rest of the band lived on touring fees and record sales, which were notoriously slow to pay out. This created instant resentment. But Jeffery didn't care about band harmony. In fact, chaos suited him. A divided band is easier to control than a united one. If the musicians are fighting each other, they aren't watching the manager. Eric Burden later described Jeffery's management style as a reign of terror. Jeffery was the fox, a man who would smile and pat you on the back while signing a deal that gave him ownership of your soul. He set up a complex web of companies, many based in tax havens like the Bahamas, specifically a company called Yameta, to funnel the band's earnings. The Animals were generating massive revenue, yet the band members found themselves constantly short of cash. When they asked Jeffery for money, he would plead poverty, blaming the record company, the taxman, or high expenses. Or he would simply intimidate them. Burden recalled moments where he would be exhausted, sick, or depressed, wanting to cancel a show. Jeffery would enter the room, the temperature would drop, and he would explain calmly, coldly, why the show would go on. He would mention the breach of contract. He would mention the people who would be upset. He would imply, without ever saying it directly, that physical safety was not guaranteed if the money stopped flowing. The band was on a treadmill. They toured incessantly to pay for the lifestyle they were supposed to have, but the harder they worked, the richer Jeffery got. By 1966, the pressure was too much. The Animals, one of the greatest bands of the British invasion, were disintegrating. The mistrust between Alan Price and the rest of the band, fueled by the royalty dispute Jeffery had engineered, caused Price to leave. The rest of the band followed suit shortly after. They were burned out, broke, and bitter. They had conquered the world, but they had nothing to show for it. For a normal manager, the breakup of his biggest act would be a disaster. But Michael Jeffery was not a normal manager. He was a strategist. He had anticipated this. He knew that rock bands were volatile entities with short shelf lives. He had already squeezed the juice out of the Animals. He didn't mourn the loss of the band. He looked at his balance sheet, which was healthy, and he looked at the landscape of the music industry. The era of the band in matching suits was ending. The era of the virtuoso, the psychedelic individualist, was beginning. He needed a new vehicle. He needed a new product. Among the wreckage of the Animals, there was one man Jeffery still found useful. Chaz Chandler, the bass player for the Animals, was a gentle giant. He was intelligent, had a great ear for music, and unlike the others, he wasn't interested in being a star anymore. He wanted to produce. Jeffery saw an opportunity. He kept Chandler close. He offered to finance Chandler's new venture as a talent scout and producer. It was a masterstroke. Jeffery would stay in the shadows, handling the business, while Chandler would be the friendly face, the artist whisperer who could find the talent. Together they looked toward America, but they weren't looking for another R&B group. They were looking for something different, something that could capitalize on the growing counterculture movement. In the summer of 1966, Chaz Chandler took a flight to New York City, bankrolled by Michael Jeffery. He went diving into the clubs of Greenwich Village. Jeffery stayed in London, sitting in his office, checking his accounts, waiting for the call. He didn't know it yet, but his greatest asset and his ultimate nemesis was waiting in a dingy club called Café Wa. The soldier from Newcastle was about to meet the voodoo child from Seattle, and the collision would burn down the world. Across the Atlantic, the future of rock and roll was struggling to pay the rent. The summer of 1966 was sweltering, and Greenwich Village was teeming with poets, drifters, and musicians, all searching for the same elusive spark. But in a dark, subterranean club called Café Wa, a young guitarist named Jimmy James was creating a fire that no one quite knew how to handle. He was playing for tourists and locals, earning meager tips and sleeping in cheap hotels or on the couches of friends. He was shy, soft-spoken, and seemingly drifting through life. But when he plugged his guitar into an amplifier, the shyness evaporated. He played with his teeth. He played behind his back. He bent the strings until they screamed in agony and ecstasy. He was channeling the blues of the Delta and the electricity of the city into a sound that was entirely new. Chaz Chandler, the former bassist for the Animals, and Michael Jeffery's new partner in talent scouting, walked into Café Wa on a tip from a friend. He was looking for a song. Specifically, he was looking for someone to cover Hey Joe, a track he was convinced could be a hit. He wasn't necessarily looking for a star, but when Chandler saw Jimmy James, the breath was knocked out of him. He didn't just see a guitarist, he saw a phenomenon. He saw the future. He approached the stage after the set, his mind already racing with the possibilities. He offered to take the guitarist to London, to manage him, to make him a star. The guitarist had only one condition. He wanted to meet Eric Clapton. It was a naive, charming request. To Jimmy James, London wasn't the center of finance or the home of Michael Jeffery. It was the land of cream, the home of the blues revival. Chandler promised him an introduction. He promised him the world. And so with a borrowed guitar and the clothes on his back, the man who would become Jimi Hendrix boarded a plane. He was leaving the poverty of New York for the swinging Technicolor dream of London. But he was also flying straight into the waiting jaws of the Yamada Company. He was flying toward Michael Jeffery. The introduction of Jimi Hendrix to Michael Jeffery in the autumn of 1966 was a meeting of two alien species. Jimmy was an ethereal creature. He spoke in riddles and cosmic metaphors. He wore velvet and scarves. He was gentle, almost painfully polite, and lived entirely in the moment. He was the embodiment of the emerging counterculture, fluid, free, and unconcerned with the rigid structures of society. Michael Jeffery was concrete. He was a man of hard edges, sharp suits, and cold stares. He spoke the language of contracts, percentages, and logistics. He didn't care about the cosmos. He cared about the bottom line. When he looked at Jimmy, he didn't see a shaman. He saw an asset. He saw a product that was unique, visually striking, and potentially enormously profitable. Jeffery agreed to co-manage Hendrix with Chaz Chandler. The division of labor was clear. Chandler would handle the creative side. He would be the good cop, the musician's friend, the producer who helped Jimi sculpt his sound. Jeffery would handle the business. He would be the bad cop, the enforcer, the man who made sure the machine kept running. For Jimi, this seemed like a fair deal. He trusted Chaz. And if Chaz trusted Mike Jeffery, then that was good enough for him. He signed the contracts. This was the first fatal mistake. The contracts Jeffery drafted were masterpieces of exploitation. They tied Hendrix to Jeffery for years, giving the manager unprecedented control over Jimi's earnings, his publishing, and his future. The percentages were heavily skewed in management's favor. The money from record sales and touring would flow not into a standard bank account, but into Jeffrey's labyrinth of offshore companies in the Bahamas. Like the animals before him, Jimi signed away his freedom, unaware of the trap hidden in the clauses. He didn't know that he had just signed away his freedom before he had even recorded his first hit. Jeffery and Chandler set about building a band around their new discovery. This wasn't going to be a democracy. It wasn't a group of friends who grew up together. It was a cast assembled to support the star. They auditioned musicians. They found Noel Redding, a guitarist willing to switch to bass, and Mitch Mitchell, a jazz-influenced drummer with a frantic, explosive style that perfectly complemented Hendrix's playing. They called it the Jimi Hendrix experience. Jeffery looked at the trio and saw marketing gold. You had the wild black American guitarist with the afro and the military jacket. You had two white British musicians with perm haircuts and mod clothes. It was visually arresting. It was controversial. It was perfect for the newspapers. Jeffery began to work the press. He spun stories. He exaggerated Jimi's background, playing up the wild man of Borneo angle. He wanted the public to be fascinated and slightly terrified. He knew that in rock and roll, danger sells. The strategy worked with terrifying speed. The band released Hey Joe in December 1966. It was a smash. Then came Purple Haze. Then The Wind Cries Mary. Within 6 months, Jimi Hendrix went from an unknown struggler in New York to the toast of London. The Beatles, the Stones, the Who, everyone came to see him play. He blew Eric Clapton off the stage. He was the new god of rock guitar. But while London was fawning over Jimi's genius, Michael Jeffery was counting the receipts. He was moving money, setting up the infrastructure of control. He was ensuring that every pound the band earned passed through his hands first. London was conquered. But Michael Jeffery knew that England was small. The real money, the empire-building money, was in America. In the summer of 1967, the Monterey Pop Festival was being organized in California. It was set to be the first major rock festival, a gathering of the tribes that would define the Summer of Love. Paul McCartney, who was on the board of organizers, insisted that the festival book Jimi Hendrix. Jeffery saw this as the strategic strike. This was the beachhead invasion. If Jimi could conquer Monterey, he would conquer America. But there was a problem. The Who were also on the bill. Pete Townshend was known for smashing his guitar at the end of his set. It was a violent, destructive, show-stopping act. Jeffery knew that if The Who played before Jimi and smashed their gear, Jimi's performance might look tame in comparison. If Jimi played before The Who, he risked being overshadowed by their finale. The backstage negotiation at Monterey is the stuff of legend. Hendrix and Townshend argued over who would go first. They eventually tossed a coin. The Who won the toss and chose to go on before Hendrix. Townshend went out and destroyed his equipment. The crowd went wild. It was anarchy. Backstage, Jeffery and Chandler huddled with Jimi. They needed an escalation. They needed something that would top the destruction of The Who. They needed a nuclear option. Jeffery, the cold pragmatist, purportedly suggested the solution: fire. Smashing a guitar was violent, Burning it was ritualistic. It was sacrificial. When Jimi Hendrix knelt on that stage at the end of Wild Thing, squirted lighter fluid onto his Stratocaster, and struck a match, he wasn't just performing. He was executing a calculated maneuver. The image of Hendrix summoning the flames, his fingers weaving magic out of the fire, became the defining image of the 1960s. The crowd stood in stunned silence, then erupted. The Who were forgotten. Jimi Hendrix had arrived in America not as a musician, but as a mythical force. Jeffery watched from the side of the stage. He didn't see the spiritual sacrifice. He saw the headlines. He saw the fee for the next concert doubling, then tripling. He saw the victory. With America wide open, Jeffery switched from strategist to taskmaster. He booked the Jimi Hendrix Experience on a relentless, punishing tour of the United States. This wasn't a tour designed for the comfort of the artist. It was a tour designed for maximum efficiency and profit. Jeffery booked them into high school gymnasiums, state fairs, and ballrooms. He famously put them on a tour supporting the Monkees, a teen pop band. It was a mismatch of epic proportions. The screaming teenage girls waiting for Daydream Believer were horrified by the loud, sexually charged psychedelic rock of the Experience. Jimmy was booed. He was frustrated. He hated it. But Jeffery didn't care. The Monkees tour gave them exposure to a massive audience, even if it was the wrong audience, and the contract was lucrative. When Jimmy finally couldn't take it anymore and flipped off the crowd, getting kicked off the tour, Jeffery spun it as a publicity coup. Hendrix is too wild for the Monkees, the paper screamed. It only added to the legend. The schedule in 1968 was brutal. They played almost every night. They crisscrossed the continent, sleeping in motels, eating junk food, and living in a bubble of exhaustion. He ran the band like an army unit. Logistics, finances, and even their passports were under his absolute command. This is a crucial point in the mechanism of control. By keeping the band cash poor, Jeffery ensured they were dependent on him for everything. If Jimmy wanted to buy a new guitar, he had to ask Jeffery. If he wanted to upgrade his hotel room, he had to ask Jeffery. It was a gilded cage. Jimmy was playing to thousands of people, generating millions of dollars, yet he felt like a child asking for an allowance. The strain of the touring, combined with the pressure to record a follow-up album, began to fracture the relationship between the management team. Chaz Chandler was a musician at heart. He cared about Jimmy. He cared about the art. He wanted to spend time in the studio perfecting the sound. He hated the chaos, the hangers-on, and the relentless greed that Jeffery brought to the table. Jeffery, on the other hand, viewed studio time as non-earning time. He wanted the albums finished quickly so the band could get back on the road. He encouraged the chaotic atmosphere in the studio, the parties, the endless jamming, because it kept Jimmy distracted and pliable. During the recording of Electric Ladyland in 1968, the tension reached a breaking point. The studio was filled with strangers, dealers, groupies, sycophants, whom Jeffery allowed to be there. Chaz Chandler tried to maintain order, tried to focus on the music, but he was losing the battle. Jimmy, fueled by the drugs and the adulation, was becoming a perfectionist, demanding dozens of takes for a single song. Chaz was frustrated by the waste of time. Jeffery was frustrated by the lack of product. But Jeffery played a deeper game. He knew that Chaz was the only person Jimmy trusted more than him. Chaz was a threat to Jeffery's total control. By creating an environment that Chaz found intolerable, Jeffery was effectively pushing his partner out. It worked. In the middle of the sessions, exhausted and disillusioned, Chaz Chandler quit. He sold his share of the management contract to Michael Jeffery. It was a tragic moment. Chaz had been the buffer. He had been the shield that protected Jimmy's artistic soul from Jeffery's commercial rapacity. With Chaz gone, the buffer was removed. Now it was just Jimmy and the Wolf. By late 1968, Michael Jeffery was the sole manager of the biggest rock star on the planet. He had achieved his objective. He had total control. He moved quickly to consolidate his power. He built a wall around Jimmy. He hired assistants who were essentially guards. These men, tough, street smart, and loyal only to Jeffrey, filtered Jimmy's phone calls. They decided who got backstage. They decided who Jimmy talked to. Jeffrey fed Jimmy's paranoia. He told him that the government was watching him. He told him that the Black Panthers were out to get him for playing white music. He told him that rival promoters wanted to kidnap him. "You can only trust me, Jimmy," Jeffrey would say. "I'm the only one who can protect you." He created a reality where Jimmy felt besieged on all sides, with Jeffrey as his only savior. It was a classic intelligence tactic. Isolate the target, induce fear, and present yourself as the solution. But Jimmy wasn't stupid. He was gentle, yes, and he avoided confrontation, but he wasn't blind. He saw the money coming in, and he saw the trickle reaching his pocket. He saw the way Jeffrey treated the other band members, Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell, like hired help. Resentment began to boil beneath the surface. Jimmy started to talk about firing the band. He started to talk about taking a break. He started to talk about music that wasn't Purple Haze. Jeffrey didn't like this talk. He wanted the hit machine to keep running. He wanted the power trio format because it was cheap. Only 3 plane tickets, only 3 hotel rooms. And it was popular. The seeds of the final conflict were sown. Jeffrey tightened his grip, but the harder he squeezed, the more Jimmy wanted to slip away. The golden goose was beginning to realize it was in a cage, and it was starting to look for the key. As 1968 turned into 1969, the dream of the 60s was beginning to curdle into a nightmare of addiction and violence. And Michael Jeffery, sitting in his office with his gun in the desk drawer, was ready for war. He had built an empire on the back of a voodoo child, and he was not going to let it crumble without a fight. The dawn of 1969 brought a chill wind to the psychedelic dream. The optimism of the previous years was hardening into something brittle and dangerous, and nowhere was this shift more palpable than in the inner circle of Jimi Hendrix. With Chaz Chandler gone, the buffer between the artist and the business was removed, leaving Jimmy exposed to the raw, unmitigated ambition of Michael Jeffery. The relationship had mutated from a partnership into a captivity, and the walls of the gilded cage were beginning to close in. Jeffery was now operating with total autonomy. He sat at the center of a web of contracts, offshore accounts, and shell companies that would have baffled a forensic accountant. He had successfully isolated his client, firing old friends and replacing them with his own loyalists. But he sensed a growing resistance in Hendrix. The guitarist was no longer the naive boy who had arrived in London with a borrowed guitar. He was a global icon, and he was beginning to ask dangerous questions about where the money was going. Jeffrey knew that control is not just about contracts. It is about psychology. To keep a man like Hendrix compliant, you couldn't just threaten him with a lawsuit. You had to make him feel unsafe. You had to make him believe that the world outside the cage was filled with wolves, and that the only man with a gun big enough to protect him was his manager. In September 1969, just weeks after the historic performance at Woodstock, this psychological warfare manifested in one of the most bizarre and terrifying episodes in rock history. It was an event that played out like a cheap detective novel, but for Jimi Hendrix, the fear was paralyzing and real. Jimmy was in New York City, a place that was increasingly becoming his sanctuary and his prison. He was frequenting the club scene, jamming with friends, and trying to explore a new musical direction. One night, he vanished. For 2 days, no one knew where the most famous musician in the world had gone. His friends were frantic. The press was sniffing around. Then Michael Jeffery received a phone call. The voice on the other end claimed that Jimi had been kidnapped. They said he was being held hostage by a group of mobsters at a house in upstate New York. They weren't asking for a ransom in the millions. They wanted a contract release or perhaps a smaller sum of cash. The details were murky, but the threat was clear. Jeffery sprang into action. He didn't call the FBI. He didn't call the police. In true Michael Jeffery fashion, he handled it in-house. He claimed to use his own connections in the underworld to negotiate Jimi's release. He disappeared for a day, then returned with a shaken, terrified Jimi Hendrix in tow. The story Jeffery told was heroic. He claimed he had gone to the safe house, stared down the mobsters, and personally rescued his client from certain death. To Jimi, who had spent 48 hours tied to a chair and threatened with violence, Jeffery appeared as a savior. The incident reinforced the narrative that Jeffery had been spinning for years. The world is dangerous. People want to hurt you, and I am your only shield. But years later, a darker truth began to emerge from the shadows. Associates of Jeffery, roadies, and insiders began to whisper that the kidnapping wasn't a mob hit at all. It was a false flag operation. The theory, supported by biographer Philip Norman and others, suggests that Jeffery hired the mobsters himself. He orchestrated the snatch and grab. He had Jimi held in a house that he likely had access to, terrorizing him just enough to break his spirit. Then he swept in to play the hero. It was a classic intelligence maneuver: create a crisis, then step in as the savior. Jeffery was applying the darker lessons of the Suez directly to his client. The objective was to make Hendrix dependent. If Jimi was thinking about firing Jeffery, and he was, this event terrified him into submission. How could he fire the man who had just saved his life? The gaslighting was absolute. Jeffery had manufactured a trauma to secure his investment. While Jeffery was securing his psychological grip, a fierce battle was raging over the music itself. This was the fundamental conflict that defined the final year of Hendrix's life: art versus commerce. Michael Jeffery viewed the original Jimi Hendrix Experience, Jimi, Noel Redding on bass, and Mitch Mitchell on drums, as the perfect product. It was a power trio, which meant low overheads, 3 plane tickets, 3 hotel rooms. It was a white rhythm section supporting a black frontman, which Jeffery believed was the key to crossing over to white audiences in America. It was a formula that printed money. Jimi, however, was bored. He felt creatively stifled by the limitations of the trio. He wanted to expand. He heard new sounds in his head: jazz, funk, R&B. He wanted to play with conga players, horn sections, and rhythm guitarists. He wanted to reconnect with his roots and play with black musicians. In the summer of 1969, Jimi dissolved the experience. He moved to a house in upstate New York and gathered a large, eclectic group of musicians. They called themselves Gypsy, Sun, and Rainbows. It was a loose communal collective, far removed from the tight, disciplined pop unit Jeffery preferred. Jeffery hated it. He looked at the stage at Woodstock, where Jimi performed with this large, extended band, and he saw waste. He saw extra salaries. He saw a lack of focus. He saw a band that was too black for the mainstream rock audience he had cultivated. He began a campaign of subtle sabotage. He would whisper in Jimi's ear that the new guys weren't good enough. He would complain about the costs. He would tell Jimi that the fans missed the old hits. He was the constant voice of doubt, chipping away at Jimi's confidence in his new direction. Jeffery's desire to break up the new band and return to the profitable status quo was aided by a legal nightmare from Jimi's past. Years before meeting Jeffery, a starving Jimi Hendrix had signed a contract with a producer named Ed Chalpin for $1. It was a terrible deal, signed in desperation, but Chalpin had held on to it. When Jimi became a superstar, Chalpin sued, claiming he had rights to Hendrix's music. The lawsuit dragged on for years, a constant cloud over Jimi's head. In 1969, a settlement was finally reached. The court ruled that Hendrix owed Chalpin an album of original material. Jeffery saw an opportunity in this crisis. He told Jimi that they had to give Chalpin an album, but they shouldn't give him a real Jimi Hendrix studio album, which was worth millions. Instead, they should record a live album. It would be quick, cheap, and it would satisfy the court order. Jimi agreed. He formed a new trio, Band of Gypsies, with his old Army buddy Billy Cox on bass and the powerful drummer Buddy Miles. It was an all-black funk rock power trio. Jeffery despised the Band of Gypsies. He saw Buddy Miles not as a drummer, but as a rival for attention. Buddy was charismatic, loud, and had a great voice. On stage, he sometimes overshadowed the shy Hendrix. Jeffery couldn't have that. He wanted Jimi to be the undisputed star, the singular product. The debut of the Band of Gypsies at the Fillmore East on New Year's Eve 1969 produced incredible music, but behind the scenes, Jeffery was plotting its demise. He viewed this band as a temporary inconvenience, a legal obligation to be discarded as soon as possible, so he could force Jimi back into the Experience format. The tension came to a catastrophic head in January 1970 at the Winter Festival for Peace at Madison Square Garden. This was meant to be a triumph for the Band of Gypsies, a massive show in Jimi's adopted hometown. Whatever happened that night remains one of the darkest mysteries of the Jeffery era. Jimi Hendrix was a seasoned drug user. He knew his limits with LSD. He was known for being able to handle his high and perform. But that night, backstage, something went wrong. Witnesses described Jimi as being in a state of catatonic dissociation. He wasn't just high, he was incapacitated. When he walked onto the stage, he looked lost. He sat down on the drum riser. He played a few disjointed notes. He refused to approach the microphone. After 2 songs of shambolic, painful non-performance, Jimi simply unplugged his guitar and walked off the stage. The crowd booed. It was a humiliation. In the dressing room afterwards, the scene was chaotic. Jeffery was furious, but some insiders noticed a strange sense of satisfaction in his rage. He immediately fired Buddy Miles, blaming him for the disaster. He dissolved the Band of Gypsies on the spot. The rumor that circulated almost immediately, and has persisted for decades, is that Michael Jeffery spiked Jimi's drink with a massive dose of bad LSD before the show. Why would a manager sabotage his own artist? The logic in the twisted world of Michael Jeffery was simple. He needed the Band of Gypsies to fail. He needed to prove to Jimi that this new direction, this all-black funk-oriented band, was a mistake. He needed a disaster so total that he could step in, clean up the mess, and reinstate the original Experience with Mitch Mitchell and Noel Redding. If Jeffery did dose Hendrix, it worked. The Band of Gypsies was finished. A few weeks later, Michael Jeffery announced to the press that the Jimi Hendrix Experience was reforming. He had won. He had broken the new band and forced his asset back into the box that made the most money. While these psychological and chemical battles were being fought, a physical monument to the conflict was being built on 8th Street in Greenwich Village. Jimi had dreamed of owning his own studio. He wanted a sanctuary, a place where he could create without watching the clock, without Jeffery standing over him counting the hourly rate. He bought a defunct nightclub called The Generation and began converting it into Electric Lady Studios. It was a visionary project designed by architect John Storick to be a curved, organic space that fostered creativity. But for Jeffery, It was a double-edged sword. On one hand, owning the studio meant they wouldn't have to pay rental fees to other studios. On the other hand, the construction costs were spiraling out of control. Underground rivers flooded the basement. Walls had to be torn down and rebuilt. The budget ballooned to over $1 million. Jeffery used the studio construction as a bludgeon. Every time Jimmy wanted to take a break from touring, Jeffery would open the ledger. "We need more money for the studio, Jimmy," he would say. "The contractors need to be paid. The equipment needs to be bought. You have to go back on the road." Electric Lady Studios, which was meant to be Jimmy's freedom, became the anchor that dragged him back onto the touring circuit. Jeffery booked a relentless run of shows in 1970, the Cry of Love Tour, explicitly to fund the construction. But where was the money really going? Jimmy was the highest paid performer in the world. He was commanding fees that were unprecedented. Yet the bills for the studio were often unpaid. Contractors threatened to walk off the job. Equipment was delayed. Jimmy began to suspect that Jeffery was siphoning off the tour money meant for the studio into his own accounts in the Bahamas. He suspected that these studio costs were being inflated to cover Jeffery's theft. The studio opened in August 1970 with a massive party. It was a triumph of design and acoustics. But Jimi Hendrix looked tired. He was thin, his skin was sallow, and his eyes were haunted. He had built his castle, but he had mortgaged his soul to the sorcerer to pay for it. In the summer of 1970, Jeffery concocted another scheme to squeeze revenue out of the Hendrix brand. He decided to produce a movie. This wasn't a concert film or a documentary. It was a vague, hippie, mystical art film called Rainbow Bridge. Jeffery convinced the studio Warner Brothers to fund it by promising them the soundtrack rights. He flew Jimmy and a crew to Maui, Hawaii. The premise of the film was incoherent, something about surfing, aliens, and meditation. Jeffery, having no experience in film production, let the project devolve into a drug-fueled vacation for the crew. Jimmy was embarrassed. He was made to act in scenes that were nonsensical. He felt like a prop. The only saving grace was the concert he performed on the slope of the Haleakala volcano for a group of hippies and surfers. But even that was marred by technical issues and high winds. Jeffery didn't care about the quality of the film. He only cared that he had secured an advance from Warner Brothers. He was moving money from one pile to another, robbing Peter to pay Paul, keeping the Ponzi scheme of his management empire afloat, while the artistic integrity of his client crumbled. By late summer 1970, the walls were closing in on Michael Jeffery. His past was catching up with him. The Animals, his first major clients, had launched a lawsuit against him, demanding accounting for millions of dollars they claimed were stolen. Other business partners were asking difficult questions. The Yameta Company in the Bahamas was under scrutiny. And most dangerously, Jimi Hendrix was waking up. Jimmy had started to hold secret meetings. He was talking to a new lawyer. He was reconnecting with Chaz Chandler, asking for advice. He was reportedly in discussions with Miles Davis about a collaboration that would bypass Jeffery entirely. Jeffrey's spies told him everything. He knew the rebellion was entering its final phase. He knew that once Electric Lady Studios was fully operational, Jimmy would have the means to produce his own music and cut Jeffery out of the loop. The manager was desperate. He was over-leveraged, facing lawsuits and staring at the prospect of losing his primary source of income. He needed a solution. He needed to secure his future. The stage was set for the final act. The flight across the Atlantic in August 1970 felt less like a homecoming and more like an exile. Jimi Hendrix was returning to London, the city that had crowned him king 3 years earlier, but the vibrancy of the swinging 60s had faded into a dull gray hangover. The bright military jackets and feather boas, now looked out of place against a backdrop of growing cynicism and fatigue. Jimi was tired. He was physically depleted from the relentless recording sessions at his new studio, and emotionally drained from the constant psychological warfare with Michael Jeffery. He was a man running on fumes, flying toward a destiny that felt increasingly like a trap. Michael Jeffery was close behind, a shadow trailing his asset. For Jeffery, this trip was not about nostalgia. It was a desperate, tactical maneuver. His iron grip was slipping, and he was shadowing his asset to the city where it all began, watching, waiting, and calculating the cost of a legend. The man who lived by absolute control now faced the sudden, total dissolution of his empire. The first stop on this doomed itinerary was the Isle of Wight Festival. It was billed as the British Woodstock, a massive gathering of the counterculture tribes on a small island off the south coast of England. Over 600,000 people descended on the site, overwhelming the infrastructure and turning the festival into a chaotic, seething city of tents and mud. When Jimi Hendrix walked onto the stage in the early hours of the morning on August 31st, 1970, the atmosphere was hostile. The crowd was tired and angry. Radicals had torn down the perimeter fences, declaring that music should be free, and fights were breaking out in the audience. Jimi looked small against the vastness of the darkness. He struggled with technical issues. His equipment buzzed and crackled, picking up police radio signals. He played with a grim determination, but the joy was gone. It was a workmanlike performance, the sound of a man fulfilling a contract rather than channeling the cosmos. Jeffery watched from the side of the stage, calculating the gate receipts. To him, the hostility of the crowd didn't matter. The quality of the performance didn't matter. All that mattered was that Jimi was there, generating revenue, keeping the cash flow alive for one more day. But even Jeffery must have sensed that the machinery was breaking down. The golden goose was losing its feathers. Following the Isle of Wight, Jeffery had booked a short tour of Europe. It was a disaster from the very first note. The weather was atrocious, the venues were chaotic, and the band was disintegrating. Billy Cox, the bass player and Jimi's oldest friend, was beginning to crack under the strain. Cox was a grounding force for Jimi, a link to his past and a stable, sober presence in a world of madness. But on this tour, Cox became paranoid. He believed that he had been drugged, that someone had slipped LSD into his drink at a party. He began to hallucinate, believing that people were trying to kill him. The tour reached its nadir in Germany, at the Love and Peace Festival on the island of Fehmarn. The weather was apocalyptic. Torrential rain and gale-force winds lashed the stage. Biker gangs, hired as security, were terrorizing the fans. When Jimi finally took the stage, he was booed. The crowd, soaked and miserable, shouted insults. Jimi played a short, defiant set and walked off. It would be the last concert performance of his life. Jeffery was furious. He needed the tour to complete to pay off the debts mounting back in New York. But with Billy Cox suffering a severe mental breakdown, the tour had to be canceled. Jeffery sent Cox back to the United States to recover, leaving Jimi alone in London. This was a critical tactical error, or perhaps a calculated move. By sending Cox away, Jeffery removed the last layer of protection around Jimi. The bassist had been the one person who watched Jimi's back, who kept the dealers and the leeches at bay. Now Jimi was isolated in a city filled with bad influences, drifting from hotel to girlfriend's apartment, vulnerable and exposed. September 1970 in London was a dark time for Michael Jeffery. The walls were finally closing in. He was facing financial ruin. The money from the endless touring had evaporated into the black hole of his offshore schemes and legal battles. He owed money to the mob, to the taxman, and to lawyers. But the most pressing threat was the expiration of his management contract with Jimi Hendrix. The initial deal, signed in 1966, was coming to an end. Jimi had made it clear to everyone in his inner circle that he had no intention of renewing it. He was going to fire Jeffery. He was going to take his master tapes, his studio, and his future and walk away. For Jeffery, this was an unacceptable outcome. He viewed Hendrix not as a human being with free will, but as property. He had invested years of his life, his money, and his reputation into building this asset. He had created Jimi Hendrix. In his twisted military logic, he owned him. And a soldier does not let the enemy capture his prize asset. He destroys it first. It is here that the story enters its darkest chapter, centered around a document that has fueled conspiracy theories for half a century. Sometime in the months leading up to September, Michael Jeffery had taken out a life insurance policy on Jimi Hendrix. This was not a standard policy designed to protect the artist's family. It was a key man policy, ostensibly to protect the management company in the event of the artist's death. The beneficiary was Michael Jeffery. The payout was $2 million. In 1970, $2 million was an astronomical sum. It was enough to pay off all the debts. It was enough to rebuild the empire. It was enough to retire to a private island and never work again. Jeffery did the math. A living Jimi Hendrix who fired him was worth zero. A living Jimi Hendrix who sued him was a liability. But a dead Jimi Hendrix? A dead Jimi Hendrix was worth $2 million cash, plus the immense value of the back catalog, the unreleased tapes, and the posthumous legend. The motive was not passion. It was not jealousy. It was arithmetic. Jimi spent his final days in London in a haze of frustration and lethargy. He was staying at the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill with a German figure skater named Monica Dannemann. Monica was one of Jimi's many girlfriends, a woman who was fiercely devoted to him, but who existed on the periphery of his inner circle. Jimi was making plans. He called Chaz Chandler, his old producer and friend, and left frantic messages. He told friends he was ready to clean house. He was talking about a new band, a new sound, a new start. He was looking toward the light, but the shadows were lengthening. On September 11th, Jimi gave an interview where he sounded uncharacteristically morbid. He talked about death not as an end, but as a transition. He seemed weary of the physical world. Jeffery, monitoring Jimi's every move through his network of spies and informants, likely saw this as a sign of weakness, or perhaps as an opportunity to construct a narrative of a depressed, suicidal star. On September 16th, Jimi went to Ronnie Scott's jazz club to see Eric Burdon and his new band, War. He jumped on stage to jam, his last public appearance. He looked frail, sweating profusely, his magic fingers struggling to find the notes. The night of September 17th began innocuously. Jimi and Monica spent the day together. They went shopping, they drank tea. In the evening, they went to a party. Jimi was agitated. He took some amphetamines to stay awake. He was complaining about the pressure, about Jeffery, about the endless demands on his soul. Sometime after midnight, they returned to Monica's basement flat at the Samarkand. What happened in those early morning hours remains a mystery wrapped in lies, contradictions, and silence. According to the official story, Jimi took some sleeping pills to come down from the amphetamines. He took Vesparax, a powerful German barbiturate. He didn't know the strength. He took 9 tablets. The recommended dose was half a tablet. He fell into a coma, vomited in his sleep, and asphyxiated. It was a tragic accident, a rock star casualty of ignorance and excess, but the physical evidence tells a different, more disturbing story. When the ambulance crew arrived at the flat later that morning, they found a scene of chaos. The doors were wide open. Jimi was on the bed, fully clothed. He was covered in vomit, but it wasn't just stomach contents. The attending doctor at the hospital, Dr. John Bannister, later made a statement that chilled the blood of everyone who heard it. He reported that he tried to resuscitate Hendrix, but it was impossible. He noted that there was a massive amount of red wine in Jimi's stomach and, crucially, in his lungs. Dr. Bannister said Jimi was drowned in red wine. Here is the inconsistency that points a finger directly at foul play. Toxicology reports showed that Jimi had very little alcohol in his bloodstream. He had drunk maybe a few glasses of wine at the party earlier, but certainly not enough to fill his lungs. How does a man drown in wine if he hasn't drunk it? The implication is terrifyingly simple. Someone poured the wine down his throat while he was incapacitated. Someone held him down and forced the liquid into his system, inducing the vomiting and ensuring the asphyxiation. If this theory holds true, the technique used was essentially a forced drowning, a method reminiscent of waterboarding. It is a precise way of killing designed to mimic an overdose. It leaves no marks. It leaves no bullet holes. It looks like a junkie choking on his own excess. It is a professional hit. The timeline of that morning is fractured. Monica Danneman gave multiple conflicting accounts over the years. She said he was alive when she woke up. She said he was dead. She said she went out for cigarettes. She said she panicked. But there is a gap of several hours between when Jimi likely died and when the ambulance was called. What happened in those hours? Some witnesses claim that Monica called Eric Burden before she called the police. Burden allegedly told her to clean up the flat to get rid of the drugs. But other whispers suggest that someone else was there, someone who came in the night. James Tappy Wright, the roadie who later wrote the explosive tell-all book, claimed that Michael Jeffery was in London that night. Jeffery had always claimed he was in Majorca, Spain, receiving the news by phone. But Wright insists Jeffery was in town, staying at a hotel, waiting for the job to be done. If Jeffery was in London, and if he had access to the flat or hired men who did, the window of opportunity was wide open. Jimi was sedated on Vesparax. He was helpless. It would have taken only a few minutes to execute the plan. The news broke on the morning of September 18, 1970. Jimi Hendrix was dead at 27. The world mourned. Fans gathered in the streets weeping. Radio stations played The Wind Cries Mary on a loop. The counterculture had lost its shaman. For decades, the idea that this tragedy was actually a murder remained just a dark rumor. But it gained a terrifying legitimacy in 2009 with the confession of James Tappy Wright, a roadie for the band. Wright recounts a night in 1971, a year after Jimi's death, when he and Jeffery were drinking heavily. Jeffery was in a dark mood, paranoid and shaking. The alcohol loosened his tongue. "I had to do it, Tappy," Jeffery reportedly said, tears streaming down his face. "You understand, don't you? I had to do it. You know what he was like. He was going to leave me. If I lost him, I'd lose everything." Jeffery described stuffing pills into Jimi's mouth and pouring red wine down his throat. He insisted it wasn't hatred. It was business. It was survival. This confession, if true, transforms the death of Jimi Hendrix from a tragic accident into a cold-blooded assassination. The man who sold the world on Jimi's genius also decided when the show was over. But while the world wept and rumors swirled, Michael Jeffery did not grieve. He went to work. For Jeffery, the death was a logistical problem to be managed and an asset to be liquidated. He operated with the cold, frantic precision of a general looting the treasury before a retreat. While Jimi's body lay in the morgue, Jeffery flew immediately to New York City, to the heart of the empire he had built on Jimi's back, Electric Lady Studios. Witnesses at the studio described a scene that resembled a raid. Jeffery and his associates arrived with empty boxes and a sense of urgency. They swept through the archives, grabbing master tapes, demos, and rough mixes. This was the black gold, the unreleased music that constituted the true value of the estate. By securing the tapes, Jeffery ensured he remained the gatekeeper. He had stolen the keys to the kingdom while the king was still warm. At the funeral in Seattle on October 1st, 1970, Jeffery stood in the background, wearing dark glasses and a dark suit. He watched the grieving family and the shell-shocked musicians like a fox in the henhouse. He knew that with Jimmy dead, the lawsuit over the management contract was moot. Then came the payout. The insurance company paid out the $2 million. Jeffery was solvent. He had survived. With the tapes secured and the insurance money in hand, Jeffery turned his attention to salvaging his other investments. The film Rainbow Bridge, filmed in Maui months prior, was a cinematic disaster, but Jeffery aggressively marketed it as a mystical document of Jimmy's final days. When released in 1971, critics savaged it, but the soundtrack album, cobbled together from the rated studio tapes, sold well. This marked the beginning of the Frankenstein era. Jeffery hired session musicians who had never met Jimmy to overdub unfinished tracks, erasing the work of original band members to create new songs for albums like War Heroes and Loose Ends. To purists, it was grave robbing. To Jeffery, it was manufacturing units for sale. However, the looting could not stop the walls from closing in. By 1972, Jeffery was fighting a war on three fronts. The Animals pressed their claim for stolen millions. The Hendrix estate began demanding audits. And most terrifying of all, rumors swirled that Jeffery had borrowed money from dangerous mob figures who now wanted their money back. Jeffery became paranoid. He checked his car for bombs and changed hotels frequently. Was this paranoia justified? Or was it the guilt of a man who knew what he had done? He retreated to a fortress-like house in Mallorca, Spain, becoming a pariah in the industry. But even in exile, he couldn't stop plotting. He was trying to secure the rights to the unreleased Hendrix material once and for all. In March 1973, Jeffery received a summons. He had to be in London for a court hearing that would decide the fate of the estate. It was unavoidable. He had to leave the safety of his Spanish fortress and return to the lion's den. There is a strange anecdote from this time involving Jimi Hendrix himself. Years earlier, Jimmy had allegedly told friends about a dream, or perhaps a psychic vision, in which he saw Michael Jeffery dying in an airplane. Jimmy had a fear of flying, but he also had a strange mystical intuition. Jeffery, despite his hard exterior, was superstitious. He knew about the curse of those who crossed Jimmy. But Jeffery was a rational man, a soldier. He didn't believe in ghosts, he believed in logistics. He booked a ticket on Iberia Airlines Flight 504 from Palma de Mallorca to London Heathrow. The date was March 5th, 1973. Moments before the catastrophe, the sky over western France appeared as a deceptive canvas of calm blue. Inside the cabin of the Douglas DC-9 cruising at 29,000 feet, the world still looked orderly to Michael Jeffery, peaceful and far removed from the sordid chaos of the music business. For a man who lived his life in the trenches of negotiation and manipulation, always watching his back, this suspension above the clouds must have offered a rare moment of detachment. Up here, stripped of his telephone and his lawyers, he was just a passenger. In his briefcase, he carried the documents that he believed would save him: contracts, riders, and the paper trail of a 7-year domination over the voodoo child. He was confident. He was a survivor. He had survived the Suez Crisis, the brutality of the Newcastle nightclub scene, the drug wars of the 1960s, and the wrath of the mob. He likely believed that this flight was just another commute, another necessary step in his endless war for survival. But on the ground in France, a different kind of war was playing out. The French civilian air traffic controllers were on strike, protesting working conditions and pay. In a desperate bid to keep the airways open, the French government had brought in military personnel to man the radar stations. These were soldiers, not seasoned controllers. They were using unfamiliar equipment, working under immense pressure, and dealing with a chaotic mix of civilian and military traffic. The intricate ballet of the skies, usually choreographed with split-second precision, was being directed by amateurs. At the same time that Jeffrey's Iberia flight was descending toward the Nantes vector, a Spantax Convair 990 Coronado was climbing. It was a charter flight bound for London as well, filled with tourists returning from the sun-drenched holidays of Spain. The skies were crowded. The radio frequencies were congested with confused pilots and stressed military controllers struggling to maintain separation between the aircraft. At 12:52 p.m., the unthinkable happened. The logic of the universe, which Michael Jeffery had spent a lifetime trying to bend to his will, asserted itself with brutal mathematical indifference. The Spantax Convair and the Iberia DC-9 arrived at the same point in space and time. The collision was catastrophic. The left wing of the Spantax aircraft sliced through the fuselage of Jeffrey's plane like a guillotine. The impact was deafening, a thunderclap of twisting metal and shattering glass that erupted in the thin air. The Spantax pilot, in a feat of miraculous airmanship, managed to regain control of his crippled aircraft. Despite severe damage to the wing, he fought the controls, descended, and managed to make an emergency landing at a nearby airbase. All 107 people on board that plane survived, shaken but alive. The passengers on Michael Jeffery's flight were not so fortunate. The Iberia DC-9, structurally compromised and spinning violently out of control, disintegrated in midair. It broke apart, spilling its contents, luggage, seats, and 68 human souls into the freezing slipstream. The wreckage rained down over the quiet fields of La Planche, a rural commune south of Nantes. There were no survivors. Michael Jeffery, the man who had orchestrated the rise of the animals, the man who had discovered Jimi Hendrix, the man who was rumored to be a spy and a killer, fell from the sky. In those final terrifying seconds, all his schemes, all his offshore accounts, and all his carefully constructed power meant absolutely nothing. The fox, who had spent his life outrunning the hounds, had been caught by gravity. The recovery operation was grim. The debris field stretched for miles. Identification of the victims was a slow, harrowing process. The impact and the subsequent fire had rendered traditional identification difficult. This ambiguity regarding the body of Michael Jeffery became the seed for one of the most enduring legends in rock history. Almost immediately after the news broke, whispers began to circulate in the dark corners of the music industry. They started in the pubs of London and the studios of New York. He wasn't on the plane. It was the kind of rumor that fit Michael Jeffery perfectly. He was, after all, a man of shadows. He was a former intelligence operative. He was a man facing prison time and financial ruin. If anyone could fake their own death, surely it was him. The theory went like this. Jeffery knew the walls were closing in. He knew the mob was coming for their money. He knew the lawsuits from the animals and the Hendrix estate were unwinnable. So he bought a ticket, checked his luggage, and then simply walked away. He slipped out of the airport, boarded a boat to Morocco or South America, and vanished into the ether, leaving a ghost to die in his place. People claimed to have seen him. There were sightings in remote villages in Spain. There were reports of a man matching his description running a bar in Brazil. He became a boogeyman, a phantom who was always just around the corner. but the reality was likely far more mundane and far more gruesome. Michael Jeffery did die that day. His body was identified not by his face, but by the jewelry he wore and the contents of his pockets. He was destroyed completely, erased from the earth in a violent flash that mirrored the chaotic energy of the music he had profited from. The briefcase containing the contracts that bound Jimi Hendrix to him was scattered across a French field, the papers fluttering in the wind, unsigned and irrelevant. The death of Michael Jeffery did not bring peace to the world of Jimi Hendrix. Instead, it created a massive sucking vacuum of power. Jeffery had run his empire as a dictatorship. He kept the secrets in his head. He kept the keys to the vaults in his pocket. He had no succession plan. He died intestate, without a valid will, leaving behind a tangled web of shell companies' debts and stolen assets. The immediate aftermath was a frenzy of looting and litigation that makes the plot of a Charles Dickens novel look simple. The Hendrix estate was now a ship without a captain, floating in shark-infested waters. Al Hendrix, Jimi's father, was the legal heir, but he was a gardener from Seattle with no knowledge of the predatory nature of the music business. He was surrounded by lawyers who saw him not as a grieving father, but as a naive mark. The Yameda Company in the Bahamas, Jeffrey's offshore fortress, collapsed. The money that was hidden there, the millions stolen from Jimi and the animals, vanished into the pockets of local lawyers and corrupt officials. The paper trail was deliberately obscured, making it impossible for the heirs to recover the stolen fortune. But the real prize was the music. With Jeffery dead, the gatekeeper was gone. The vault at Electric Lady Studios and the stash of tapes Jeffery had hidden in various locations became the target of a free-for-all. In the years following 1973, the market was flooded with subpar Hendrix releases. Without Jeffery to at least maintain a semblance of a release schedule, bootleggers and unscrupulous record executives began to strip mine the archives. One figure emerged from this chaos to take Jeffrey's place as the controversial steward of the legacy, Alan Douglas. Douglas was a producer who had known Jimi briefly. In the power vacuum left by Jeffrey's death, Douglas managed to convince the estate to let him take control of the unreleased tapes. What Douglas did next was, to many purists, a crime against art that rivaled anything Jeffery had done. Douglas took the unfinished master tapes, the jams, the demos, the sketches, and erased the original backing tracks. He wiped the bass lines played by Billy Cox. He wiped the drum tracks played by Mitch Mitchell. He hired session musicians Jimi had never met, to re-record the rhythm sections. He claimed he was updating the sound, making it modern. He released albums like Crash Landing and Midnight Lightning. On the credits, he listed himself as a co-writer alongside Jimi Hendrix. It was the ultimate insult. Even in death, Jimi was being manipulated. Michael Jeffery may have exploited Jimi for money, but he generally left the music alone. Douglas was altering the art itself. This era of mismanagement can be directly traced back to the crash in Nantes. If Jeffery had lived, he might have continued to exploit Jimi, but he would have protected the asset's integrity because it was profitable. His death broke the seal, allowing a flood of vultures to pick the carcass clean. There is a profound, almost Shakespearean irony in the manner of Michael Jeffery's death. Consider the accusations leveled against him regarding Jimi Hendrix, the theory that he waterboarded Jimi with red wine, the theory that he suffocated him, the theory that he killed him to claim an insurance payout because Jimi was worth more dead than alive. And then look at Jeffery. He died in a violent accident where his body was crushed and burned. He died while chasing the legal rights to a dead man. He died carrying the weight of his own greed. Many in the rock community viewed the crash not as a tragedy, but as a cosmic correction. It was karma. It was the universe balancing the books. The man who had treated human beings as disposable commodities was himself disposed of by a mechanical failure. Upon hearing of Michael Jeffery's death, Eric Burden of the Animals did not offer condolences. Instead, he expressed a grim relief. The nightmare is over. But the nightmare was far from over. Jeffery had redefined management from facilitation to predation. He was the patient zero of the corporate raider style, a man who proved that you could commodify, control, and drain an artist dry. His methods became the dark template for the industry, a blueprint for the unfair contracts and exploitative practices that would plague musicians for decades to come. Jeffery's ghost lingered long after the crash. He had successfully distorted Jimi's public image, painting the sensitive artist as a drug-addled wild man to sell tickets. He tried to bury the existence of black gold, the acoustic tapes that revealed Jimi's true, evolving spirit. For the family, Jeffery's death triggered a new bureaucratic hell. Caught in a web of shell companies and offshore accounts, Jimi's father, Al Hendrix, was maneuvered by sharks into signing away his son's rights for a pittance. It would take 20 years and the backing of billionaires to finally reclaim the legacy that Jeffery had stolen. And hanging over it all is the shadow of the ultimate crime. The discrepancy between the wine in the lungs and the alcohol in the blood remains a chilling, unresolved dissonance in the song of Jimi's life. With the contract expiring and the insurance money waiting, the suspicion that Jeffery liquidated his golden goose is not just a conspiracy theory. For many, it is the only logical conclusion to a partnership built on greed. Ultimately, Michael Jeffery left a scar on the face of history. He destroyed the lives of those around him, leaving men like Chaz Chandler and Noel Redding haunted by what-ifs. He may have been the necessary devil who forced Jimi Hendrix onto the world stage, but the price of admission was the artist's soul. Today the fox is gone, erased in a flash of fire over France. But the music he tried to possess remains untouchable, a wild, free thing that no contract could ever bind.